Hey everyone, welcome to Climb by VSC. Each week we interview innovative founders, category experts, and the most active climate investors about their perspectives, lessons, and best practices for company building in climate tech. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by our friend and co-investor, Raj Kapoor. Raj is co-founder and managing partner of Climactic, a VC fund focusing on climate technology. Raj brings to Climactic over 15 years of investing experience from his time as managing director and venture advisor at Mayfield Fund, as well as a depth of operating experience as CEO and co-founder of both Snapfish and Fitmob. Raj, I feel like I can't do your entire background justice, but I'm just going to say thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be here, no problem.
Awesome, man. Well, let's kick things off. Let's talk a little bit about that background that you have both as an investor and operator and how that led you to founding Climactic.
Yeah, so, I've kind of gone back and forth, probably a non-traditional path of first starting out at a startup, which was called At Home, which then became Excited Home, which is doing broadband services and applications on top of that, and got the entrepreneurial bug to start something in the media space, and I love photos, so I jumped into Snapfish, then became a VC, and then went back into, I just got the bug again to be an entrepreneur. So did Fitmob, and it was a pleasure to be working with Vijay Chattha on that. And after that, the calling, actually in 2005, 2006, in my early days of being a venture capitalist, I always like to have one thing that I focus on outside of work, so one cause. And initially it was a lot around helping youth, and I joined the board of Do Something. And then eventually I went to the TED conference, and I was listening to both Al Gore and John Doerr speak about climate and how it is probably the biggest crisis that we have and the most complex and the hardest, and the one that is irreversible. And it infects everyone, not just one population. So I thought, wow, why aren't I working on that? And so that was the kind of the genesis. While I was a VC, I did a nonprofit, launched a social game to build awareness around climate. That didn't work, and I realized that for-profit ways maybe could scale better. And so I started investing at Mayfield, looking at ways to harness what we learned from the internet, like network effects and marketplaces. And I led the Series A in Lyft, which was trying to make transportation more efficient and lower emission. And so that led me to then I did the detour and did Fitmob and came back. And after that, we merged with a company called ClassPass. I thought, okay, that was interesting, fitness and health, but I really need to revisit climate. It's not gotten any better while I was working on fitness. So in 2016, I had an idea around starting a fund that's focused around cities and helping them decarbonize through smart technology investments. And I pitched this idea to Logan and John, the founders of Lyft, because I've known them well for a long time. And they said, it's a good idea, but you should come and join us. And you could execute operate rather than investing. So I said, okay, I'll jump in. And I became chief strategy officer at Lyft for 4.5 years. And my job there was to take us to an electric, self-driving, shared future. So from what Lyft is today to that in the future, it's still a work in progress. We had our hands full with COVID, et cetera, but that progress continues, but we're still years away from true self-driving. And in 2020, I realized that my talents could be best used if I went back again to venture with an idea that was a bit broader than just cities, but really looking at this new area of climate tech. It started out with clean tech in version 1, and then it broadened to include lots of different sectors, a lot more capital efficiency, and real customers that wanted to buy products and generate revenue. And this was really climate tech. And so I partnered with a friend of mine, Josh Felser, who I've known for over 20 years, who's also been repeat founder, also a venture capitalist. And we joined forces and decided to start Climactic at the end of 2020. And so that was really the genesis behind it, was that early day at TED, trying to play in the nonprofit space, investing at Mayfield, realizing that I want to spend all my time on it, but getting a nice chunk of operating experience in transportation, which is one of the biggest sectors that's impacted by climate.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic to hear the trajectory of that journey. I guess what I'm interested in hearing, given that you've sort of had one foot in the operating world, one foot in the investing world and going back and forth, how has it changed the way that you look at the businesses that you invest in? Having operated sort of in different decades around different technologies, around different methods of customer acquisition, how does it change how you invest today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think being an operator gives you a sense of humility that you really don't have the answers. And so there's an ability to relate to the entrepreneur and a lot of their challenges that they're going through, not just on a business level, but on a personal level. So that's super important. Lots of things change. Every 5 years, technologies change, platforms change. We started out with internet, then we moved to mobile. Then for a while, maybe it was VR, but not really. And now there's Web3. So you learn to adopt and to adapt to new platforms. And there are opportunities every time around new platforms. Is something that I've learned. So you look at those platform shifts really seriously. But this one really struck me as something very different. So I think what I learned as an investor and as an operator is that what created a huge wave of innovation and change was the digitization of everything that happened in the late 90s, 2000s, 2010s. Now, what we're seeing is an imperative to have the decarbonization of everything. And that opportunity is potentially even larger. So we're talking about trillions of dollars that are necessary to decarbonize the planet. And it cuts across every industry. Just like the digitization of everything, yes, it impacted media a lot, but it also has impacted things like healthcare, things like manufacturing. We're seeing the same thing. Yes, energy is going to be the most impacted by the decarbonization of everything, but every industry is going to have to decarbonize in some way, shape, or form in doing it. So I recognize that big wave where I was both an investor and a founder has now hit us in a different way. And it's an imperative to make sure that we have a planet that our children and grandchildren can enjoy.
So when we think about Climactic's thesis, or at least the primary thesis of helping enterprise, companies hit that zero emissions goal, what does that mean practically? And then where do the startups that you back play into that?
Yeah, and so to take a step back, we looked at the problem of the decarbonization of everything. And we said there are three constituencies. There's consumers, there's governments, and there are enterprises. Each of them have a role in decarbonization. As we studied it and made investments and talked to a lot of experts, what we concluded on our opinion is that the consumer is not the answer in getting there, because they're going to be actually consuming more energy on average per capita when you include the developing world in the next 10 to 20 years. We can't expect them to just stop consuming energy. It's not fair. Secondly, they're not going to pay a premium for green products. Then we look at governments and we say, okay, well, the government can solve it all through policy. Clearly, that hasn't happened. And we don't have a lot of expectation, given the gridlock worldwide, that we can rely just on governments. Yes, we have to keep pushing that. It's amazing that the IRA was passed and that we have a massive amount of incentives now that are going into the system, but it's not enough. That leaves us to the third constituency, which is where most of our focus is enterprise. The reality is the enterprise is now pressured by investors, by consumers, all and their leadership and their employees to decarbonize. And most, in fact, 75% of worldwide GDP is now under a net zero plan. And when we talk to a lot of these enterprises, we found that they have committed, but they don't know how to get there. And innovation is key. And a lot of what the money that the IRA, this new act, Inflation Reduction Act, has went into is all around innovation, because our way to get there, the fastest way to get there, is to innovate. So that's what we're doing, is to find technologies, startups that can help enterprises hit their net zero goal, whether they're mobility enterprises, manufacturing enterprises, whatever it is, we're working on it to get there. And yes, there'll be some new consumer opportunities, but really we're looking for businesses to create those products that consumers want that are negative or zero emissions.
Yeah. Let's talk about some of the companies that you've seen or that you've gotten excited by on, as you've been building Climactic. What are the techniques or strategies that these companies have found most effective when trying to move enterprises towards that decarbonization, that net zero goal?
It's a lot like the digitization of everything, where the first thing you have to do is measure. What we're seeing is a lot of exciting companies in the data and software space, which is unlike the clean tech, where it was all about huge technology, deep tech like new solar thin film or what have you. This is about block and tackling. So, for example, we invested in a company called Sinai, and what they do is they measure all of the carbon emissions in a massive manufacturing company that has multiple factories all across the world. It's a very complicated problem. And then they work that data, and that software helps the CFO create scenarios upon getting to net zero because they have cost. So what's the best path to get there in doing it? So measuring is the first thing. And there again, we've seen a positive boost because the US government and other governments around the world are now mandating that there's a measurement of carbon emissions for companies that are public. And so they're going to have to buy software and they're going to have to analyze data. And once they know where they're at, then they can actually start the reduction of it. And then there's a whole set of companies that can help you do that and help you around the supply chain, around manufacturing, and around creating new products for consumers that are lower carbon.
So you mentioned in TechCrunch when Climactic was announced that you believe that investing in startups that don't have to sacrifice value in the pursuit of environmental friendliness is important or is a priority. What kind of businesses meet that criteria? You mentioned earlier, too, that consumers don't necessarily want to pay higher prices to do things that are green. So who meets this criteria and what kind of deals have you worked on that fit that category?
Yeah, and so an example of that, well, so first of all, it's even more important right now in this recessionary environment that we're in because companies will delay if there's an extra cost around emission reduction. So it's really finding that sweet spot that provides them, usually it's around efficiency. So if they use this, for example, there's a company that, as I mentioned on Sinai, where they're coming in and measuring emissions, they're also being able to look at what is the efficiency and take it to the supply chain and notice where there are supply chain problems. Another example is Climate.ai, which is a company that looks 6 months to 10 years out. For example, their first industry is food and ag, and they look and see what is the likelihood of crops in certain areas so that big ag is making huge investments that are years of a cycle. They can make smarter investments in doing that. So now they're saving money because they're not putting crops in the wrong place, but they're also doing it in a way that is aligned with lower emissions as well.
Is there a category you feel is overhyped or overfunded when you think about attacking climate?
I think that last question, let's take it again because I have a simpler answer for it.
Okay,
so let's take
let me go back.
Yeah.
Let me go back to that. No, totally. No. So Raj, you mentioned in TechCrunch that investing in startups that don't have to sacrifice value in the pursuit of environmental friendliness is a priority for Climactic. What kind of businesses meet this criteria, and are there any deals that you've worked on that fit that model?
So not sacrificing value is absolutely critical, especially now in a recessionary environment. Businesses are looking for solutions that not just lower emissions, but also lower costs. Usually it's through increased efficiency. So whether it's, and one example of this is companies that are helping around supply chains. Supply chains are broken. There's challenges there. A lot of supply chain challenges we have today are also due to weather and climate change. One example is large food and ag industry. They're not sure which crops will work in which regions in the longer run. So let's say a year from now, 2 years from now. So they need better predictive models. So we found a startup that has incredibly good AI and ML models that they've developed over time that can better help them predict so that they can make the right investments. So now they're saving money by not wasting, and they're being able to figure out where there is going to be climate resilience and where there's going to be change, as an example. So that's something that is working well. Any company that is helping companies measure is usually also helping them with efficiency. So even though they're measuring carbon, they're also looking at how can they be more efficient in reducing the carbon of the operation as well.
No, fantastic. And I think you sort of said it well. You cannot change what you cannot measure. And for so long, there hasn't been a standardized, agreed upon set of metrics. And I feel like now that companies are focused on this, you need to start establishing that as well. Are there any categories that you feel like are overhyped or overfunded when it comes to climate technology?
So at a macro level, we're spending roughly $40 billion, I think I last looked, on climate tech a year in venture. If you look at some of the studies that are there, BCG has a study out saying that roughly 40% of the reduction that we have doesn't exist and needs to come from innovation to get to a net zero planet by 2050. So when you do the math on, well, we need to plug a hole of 40% of emissions reduction through innovation, and you think about the capital that's necessary and realize that some of it's going to work and some of it's not going to work, we're woefully underspending overall. in climate tech by like an order of magnitude. So I would say from an overall perspective, we need way more capital going into innovation in order to hit the 2050 goal that we have. Now, there are some areas that, for example, fintech around solar, there's some really exciting companies, but now there are a ton of companies that are jumping into that space where there's too many companies going to it. And the question is, how big is the moat there? Can they all survive? Or is it just going to be a few? And has the train already left the station? Because there's already companies that have been created that have scale in that area. So that's one example. But I would say overall, we're underfunded.
Yeah. Greenwashing continues to be a term that comes up, especially as you and I, get pitched companies that are slapping a climate label on top of whatever technology they're already building. How do you make sure your portfolio companies don't fall into that trap of being labeled under greenwashing? And what are criteria that you look for when you're evaluating deals to make sure that they are actually contributing to decarbonization, that it's not sort of in name only?
When you do a venture capital investment memo, typically you look at the economics of it and you look at what the returns are going to be. We have an additional analysis that we do on every company that we invest, which is we look at the carbon reduction, or if there are other environmental benefits, we try our best to quantify it. At an early stage, it's more of an art, not a science. There's lack of data that's there, but you do your best to see, is there an order of magnitude reduction that if this company is really successful, that'll have impact on the world. In fact, Bill Gates' fund looks at roughly 0.5% of reduction in global emissions before they would fund a company. So they want to see that potential upon success in doing it. So there are ways to get closer there. And then every year, you look back at the mission and say, is it still working out? Did they drift into something else? And you help those companies stay on track. Now, the founders of these companies are absolutely committed to climate change reduction. And so usually that's not an issue. Their mission and their vision that people joined are all about going after that.
Maybe this is the cynic in me, but I guess, is there an independent audit of these companies when they make certain claims that says, hey, we're reducing X kilotons per year at scale? Like, is that something that you're doing in diligence where you're saying, okay, well, we actually want to audit the work specifically, or is there an independent body or agency that actually qualifies this?
There are several independent agencies that specifically exist in the area of carbon credits. So if a company or a startup says, hey, I'm reducing emissions or I'm sequestering carbon from the environment through trees or soil or what have you, there's third parties that will validate, okay, how much, whatever their methodology is, what's the true CO2 tons that they're avoiding or sequestering. And they look at things like additionality. Would those trees not have been knocked down anyway in doing it? So there's a lot of people that are working on this. There isn't one standard yet. It's an area that's frankly moving a little slow. And we think there's room for innovation, which is how do you get these standards faster? Because it's holding back there's a lot of demand for carbon credits right now, but the supply of high quality is lower. And so we need to speed that up.
Yeah. So moving to the sort of company building and company advising side of it, coming to Climactic, there's no doubt that you and Josh have extensive experience on sort of general company building. How does that change when you are advising companies building in climate tech, or maybe does it change, or is it very much like the companies that you and Josh have already built and advised?
We are targeting, we usually do seed round investing, pre-seed, seed, or Series A. And at that point, there's typically already a technology. The climate science behind it has already occurred. And what they really need help is, how do we build teams? How do we grow revenue? How do we sell to the enterprise? These are things that we've done before, both as investors and founders. How do you manage through chaos? How do you manage through a downturn? So these are things that we can really help us bring the best of general tech. And what we found is also, we're part of an organization called Climate Draft, which is bringing over 100 plus tech executives per quarter and matching them and educating them with climate tech companies in doing it. So that general tech bridge is really important, is what we bring over there. We also have on our team as a strategic partner, Paul Hawken, who wrote the seminal book called Drawdown, and now a book called Regeneration. And he's looked at every climate solution there is and wrote about it and did research on it. So he brings a lot of that expertise in to help us make decisions.
Is there anything specific that you feel like, for the climate founders that are watching or listening to this, that they need to do differently as opposed to founders in general tech that you feel like, you want to advise them to do a little bit sooner?
First of all, especially now, literally in the last few weeks, there's a huge amount of money that is available non-dilutive as grants and loans, depending on the stage of the company. So being able to navigate that landscape of government money and even philanthropic money is something that climate tech is unique in doing it. Secondly is the intersection with policy. We don't like to make bets where it relies on a policy change, but it can accelerate and augment a company. So being savvy around what policy exists or what policy is coming is another element that's important. I saw that at Lyft in a very big way as well. So it's not different in transportation, but that doesn't exist, for example, in digital media as much.
Yeah. So you spoke a little bit earlier about, and I happen to agree with you, that we cannot rely on government solely to be actually taking the action. Subsidies and dollars being available is certainly a positive. Thinking about it on the other way, from a risk standpoint, when you're evaluating a deal or an opportunity, how do you price in or consider government creating a negative impact on the companies that you're looking at? Or are there certain categories that you stay away from, given the impact that government action might have on that business model?
So we do look at whether or not the economics can stand alone make sense without incentives, even if there's an incentive that exists right now, because those can change every 2 to 4 years that are there. So that's, I think, really important. We're also looking on as they scale up. So for example, what Lyft was doing early on, it didn't have as much of an impact, but as you scale up, it has a bigger impact, and you have to partner with the city to be able to do that. So understanding where they're going to face headwinds in the future, and are they aware of that? You can't solve those headwinds at the earliest stage, but if you have an entrepreneur that understands it and that we can help them build out the team and think through the strategy on that, that's really important as well.
I feel like a lot of founders think about hiring being sort of, they close their round, they get Climactic as a lead investor, they've got the capital, and now they've got to go and convince that talented, 10x engineer to leave Amazon or to leave Facebook and come work on a climate solution. What have you seen work? What's been productive when your founders are going out there and trying to recruit top tier talent to come work on climate?
So what's exciting is that top tier talent is raising their hand and saying, I want to work on something meaningful. Maybe I was working at Facebook or Meta and I was in the ad program, and how much is that really helping the world? Or I was working on increasing engagement. And so what we're seeing is that there's a proactive move there. And then in terms of recruiting, if we're doing a recruiting and we're trying to target someone that's in general tech, it really does come down to the mission and what kind of legacy does that person want to leave, which is super critical. And so it has not been a problem. And also these companies there's not much of a difference in terms of the funding that climate tech or general tech has in terms of the demand for. In fact, there's even more, it hasn't had as much of a slowdown, the climate tech subsector in venture recently. So they don't have to necessarily take a sacrifice like they're joining a nonprofit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And do you think from a fund construction standpoint, that changes how you think about, timelines and time horizons? We talked about clean tech, lots of heavy investment, maybe not the most capital efficient category. When you think about Climactic and how you build, does it change the time horizons that you have for your fund?
So I think this is where there are different strategies that venture firms have in climate. So example, again, Breakthrough Energy Ventures, which is Bill Gates' fund, has deliberately created a fund that is 20 plus years. And it's important because to go after some of those massive, big, structural, deep technology opportunities like fusion, you need to have that long-term viewpoint. For us, we're going after more of the here and now and less of a deep tech bet. So more around software and data services that businesses and mobility companies can be using right away. And so we believe that a 10-year fund life cycle makes sense.
I like it, Raj. I think when I come back to the need to increase the number of founders that are actively building in the space, I come back to how much venture capital is flowing in, right? You talked about 40 billion of venture capital flowing into climate tech broadly. What is advice that you would have for founders that are just starting out in this space, that are looking to access that capital? What do they need to be doing in order to get funded as a climate tech startup?
I think we have a great little ecosystem that is growing fast that can help them. So whether it's people like us or accelerators that exist, there's Elemental Accelerator, there's Powerhouse, there's Activate. There's a number of different organizations that work with first-time or even repeat founders from general tech that are jumping over to climate tech, Climate Draft, as I mentioned. So there's a number of different ways that they can come up to speed on the industry. And then the insight, the technology, that also what we're seeing is that because it's so broad and hits everything, it hits housing, it hits transportation, it hits healthcare, it really can use expertise and talent across the industries. So whatever vertical you're in, there's a way to come in and to jump onto climate tech as well.
Mm-hmm. What surprised you the most coming from, general investing, obviously spending time in wellness and other categories, to now investing in climate? Is it anything about the founders or just the businesses themselves that surprised you the most?
It's a good question. I find the founders to be very similar, except probably a bit more mission-oriented than the average tech company that's there. I see more of a diversity as well that's there in founders, which is really positive. And then I would say the other thing that's different there is they're really looking at the long run and what they want to achieve. Very few are like, hey, I can make something and sell it and flip it in 3 years or something like that. Like, they're going after and tackling emissions reduction. And we know that we have a journey ahead of us to 2050 to hit the goal for the planet. So that helps align everyone towards long-term thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let's close where we like to close with a lot of our guests. Knowing what you know now as an investor in climate tech, working with climate companies, what is a piece of advice you would give your younger self?
My first idea is, hey, you should have done this earlier, but I think actually the timing may be better in the last year or two to get involved in this. So I think the timing was right to kind of see this new version of climate tech that's there. The other advice that I would give to my younger self is that keep learning and have an open and curious mind. I wish I would have spent more time looking at even a broader set of industries than I have. I went very deep into transportation in some areas, but there's so much out there. So my challenge is, how can I learn as much as I possibly can to add value and to pick the best founders to go after opportunities, because it's just such a broad area.
Well, Raj, this is fantastic. I mean, I learned a ton today, especially about the fact that, to get enterprise to start actually moving forward and taking their net zero commitment seriously, we've got to be holding them accountable. And the way to do that is to actually have real measurement, and then from that measurement, real insights that they can, actually act on, that are actionable. So that's sort of my biggest takeaway for today. Raj, where can people find you and Climactic if they want to work with you?
Well, we have a brand new exciting website, www.climactic.vc. So check it out.
Fantastic. Raj, thank you so much for joining us on Climb, and we are excited for all the success coming your way at Climactic. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.